Good morning, colleagues. It is my very great pleasure to welcome all of you to the launch of our first UGA Center for Sociological Research and Practice and the Department of Sociology webinar series where we acknowledge the unyielding COVID-19 context where we currently living under. This juncture of COVID-19 together with the global impact of the Black Lives Movement serves as an opportune moment to interrogate the multiple complexities of how we come to understand the state of power. Today, we have two very distinguished guests who will unpack for us the state of power at play in society. Before I introduced our distinguished guests, I would just like to lay down a few ground rules. One is that we are now we are live on Facebook, streaming from Facebook. The other ground rule is please to keep yourself muted and turn off your videos. You can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, as well as the chat function to raise questions, post comments, and I will monitor that as we go along. One of our guest speakers, Advocate Erin Richards, unfortunately could not make it today, and we have in her place Heinrich Bomke, who is the leader of the Rule of Law project at Democracy Works. So thank you very much, Heinrich, for stepping in at such short notice. Let me introduce Professor Cooper, who is a visiting professor at the University of Johannesburg. Professor Satasivan, and more popularly known as Sats Cooper, was associated with Steve Biko from 1968 and involved in the advent of Black consciousness. The first accused in the so-called SASO BPC trial, he and 8 other activists were charged under the Terrorism Act for attempting to overthrow the apartheid state after organizing the Viva Frelimo rallies in September 1974, the only time that Cyril Ramaphosa was also detained. He was banned and under house arrest in February 1973 and jailed for 9 years, including over 5 years in Robben Island, where he shared a cell block with Nelson Mandela. Only allowed to study in the last 2 years of imprisonment, Prof. Cooper went on to complete a degree in psychology via correspondence with the University of South Africa. Thereafter, after his release, he studied at the University of Witwatersrand, where he completed his PhD as a Fulbright scholar at Boston University. He has held many leadership and academic roles, one as the president of the Psychological Society of South Africa. He was vice chancellor and principal of University of Durban Westville prior to its merger. He's also served as the president of the International Congress of Psychology, which was held in 2012 in Cape Town. And there, Prof. Cooper was elected as the first African president of the International Union of Psychological Science, a kind of United Nations for 90 national psychology organizations and 20 regional organizations. He also serves currently as a visiting professor at the University of Johannesburg, and we are very honored to have him today. Thank you, Professor, for making time to talk to us. The floor is yours. As I've indicated, you have 15 minutes, and you may proceed.
It is my singular honor to share with you all in our splendid isolations certain perspectives on what has become the worst global public health emergency in a century, but also in what has become a moving disaster for our country and other countries around us and parts of the rest of the world. I must confess that after the World Health Organization declared COVID-19, the novel coronavirus, a pandemic on the 11th of March, our government responded fairly quickly with measures that included a total lockdown and with very regular information briefings. And for the first month and a half, maybe even 2, I felt a sense of pride that our government was doing what it did in this much controversial National Command Council. And I think most of us suspended our critical insights, what was glaring us almost every day, because we wanted the country to succeed, because we wanted what the president put out in fairly eloquent addresses to the nation. The first couple or three were very engaging. We wanted the country to come out of this better than it was at the time it entered it. And I suppose we, internationally, the language is, will there be herd immunity? We wait for a vaccine, that kind of thing. And in a sense, we experienced the herd mentality by enabling the government to actually control our lives. We did it with grace in the most part, until it became quite apparent that what we tended to overlook, and I'll just give a couple of examples. One, the regulations which had glaring grammatical and other errors, other regulations having to supersede them, the order that the president gave to the troops at Doornkop, and immediately after he left the podium, the singing started of Mshiniwam. And the immediate contradiction that emerged in my mind was, what the hell is going to happen when troops entrusted with supporting law and order were already singing Mshiniwam? And sure enough, a month later, Collins Khoza is killed by soldiers. There has to be a court action to actually force government to adhere to its own protocols with regard to the role of the military. And recall that we're not in a state of emergency. This is a health emergency. So with the pronouncements by different persons, including the Minister of Police saying the South African police services will support the military. Minister, it's supposed to be the other way around. The military is there to support the police because they have no civilian functions. They ought not to have the civilian functions that vest with SAPs. But, and young people pointed this out to me, that the police, who in the main have remained fairly hidden in their police stations, supported by private security, and last night there was an attack in Bushbuck Ridge in a police station where they were disarmed. We've had a pusillanimous, at best, police service, allowing the kind of lawlessness to run rampant. So with Big Brother, the military there, all of a sudden you saw the assertion by SAPS and heaven forbid, the Metropolitan Police as well. Who can ignore the little infant, probably hardly 2 years old, being traumatized in Stanger for being just outside the gate of his house? And some bureaucrat says there was no incident to investigate further. Can you imagine that little child being traumatized in that way? And it was caught on camera. And the authorities actually adopting an approach that is very, very problematic. Save for the president, who has acknowledged some of these flaws. I think other cabinet ministers have tended to revel in the state of health emergency, to actually do the kinds of things that have not met the country's needs. And I'm going to give a couple of examples. Of course, when the president made his initial pronouncements and follow-up, he talked of the billionaire support from the Oppenheimers, the Ruperts, and then subsequently the Motsepe and Sanlam entities. But there's a solidarity fund that the president set up, and Dis-Chem pharmacies were found guilty of price gouging. But lo and behold, they get a contract, they're rewarded. The price gougers are rewarded to provide testing to those who are not on medical aid and who cannot afford it. That means 85% of the population out there. And what do? They set up drive-through testing at malls like the Mall of Africa and Pavilion and so on. So the question is, will they allow taxis to come through and their occupants, their passengers, to be tested? So this looks like another kind of scam. The enablement that has happened recently, we haven't seen the statistics, but I'm fairly clear that those who control the economy have been at the upper echelons of that economy, have benefited from this period. And the question is, will we return to the pre-March 11th period? I'm afraid that the world has inexorably changed. We are not going to return to that place. And initially, some of us thought the world will be a better place because it gives us this time to think about what is meaningful, what is around us, the people who matter in our lives, and to be able to emerge with a greater resolve. However, it's become patent that unless people make their voices heard distinctly and clearly, like the taxi drivers have done, or the taxi industry has done, there's not going to be any restoration of the sense of agency we've had. Heaven knows, Professor Raghunan has mentioned the Black Lives Matter, and we, who have experienced one of the most rabid forms of racism in recent history, have been somewhat mute when it comes to our solidarity with those people who have taken to the streets in defiance of their own lockdown and other conditions in the cities of the world, even Sydney and other places. But we've not seen that. And somehow it speaks to that herd mentality, how we become accustomed to certain things, how we become almost removed from ourselves and our own history, such that when suffering, when blatant oppression, like that has happened to George Floyd and others, just doesn't touch us. And yet, we are responsible. Universities throughout the country were involved in the Roads Must Fall and the Fees Must Fall movement. And lo and behold, in the last couple of weeks, literally, all that we stood for, and you as students in particular stood for, is happening in the capitals of the world. But we stand by as passengers watching this. So we're supposed to be like the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres eloquently said on the 23rd of April, that we are all in this together. But really, are we all in this together? When clearly the wealthy benefit, and the taxi strike may actually cause a lot of middle-aged folks to be irate. But recall that what they're asking for is a subsidy. They provide the biggest movement of passengers in this country on a daily basis, and they're not subsidized. Whereas Gautrain, which underpins middle class and wealthy travelers, automobile manufacturers, including upper end Mercedes, BMW, VW, and Toyota, SAA, are subsidized. So in this period, we find our criticism fairly muted because we are not on the ball when it comes to some of these issues. The media has been filled with COVID-related issues, so that the 3 billion that just was discovered recently during COVID, nobody has raised any noise about. Probably it's because there's no black person to blame. Then we get on the 11th of June, the ConCourt ruling that the electoral the electoral system is seriously flawed and needs to be brought in line with the tenets of our Constitution. I must admit that I belong to various chat groups, ex-prisoners, activists, and so on. What struck me on the 11th of June was ex-prisoners, political prisoners, who until then were bemoaning their lot, being marginalized by this very government that they helped bring to power. When the ConCourt decision was announced, some said, the judiciary is captured. These are a bunch of reactionaries. Some even asked, so must we have Kanye Mbao as mayor, and must we have Solumzi as premier? You know, my response is, we've had the politicos, we've had the enabled, the card carrying, the captured representatives of the party in power. Maybe Kanye and Solomzi will do a much better job than the politicians who clearly are incompetent, unwilling, and have lost touch with the population that they will reach out to fairly soon if local government elections start happening. But notice that immediately after that decision, the leadership of the ANC and EFF reached a compact. Let's come back to our own role in the academy. In this period, we've seen some naked racism, like the article by an economist on the choices for careers in biology, and then others justifying it. It is a matter of serious concern that in a liberal, laissez-faire democracy like ours, Black academics have to remain incognito in one of the premier universities in this country. Why do they have to just call themselves Black academics without identifying themselves? It says that there's a culture of fear, a racism, systemic, and the twin of that racism is sexism. And we've seen the spurt in gender-based violence once liquor was allowed. Tobacco has still not been allowed. The shoddy presentation in court of what the government put across without even referencing. If these were our students, they would have been failed. Yet these are the bureaucrats who, a few of them, are controlling government in this country and allowing the kinds of excesses for friends and others. I don't know if you've looked at some of the regulations, but who on earth decides that women should wear cropped pants together with boots rather than open-toed sandals. I mean, this smacks of the height of stupidity. People have the time to do things like that, or more sinister, that they already, it's something to benefit some supplier out there. I think, friends, that the world is changing. What we left behind pre-March 11th, hopefully will turn for the better, but it will not spontaneously do so unless we restore our sense of agency. And I think it's about time that we move beyond party politics and reclaim our country and the democratic gains that we have brought about. Nobody liberated us. It's time for us to move beyond the cobwebs of our restrictions and our timidity. I thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Cooper. That was a very cogent and on the point analysis of the state as in South Africa at the moment. I'm going to now introduce Professor William Gumede, and I thank Prof. Gumede for making his time available. I know this is not an easy period. Prof. Gumede is an associate professor at the School of Governance at the University of the Witwatersrand. He is a co-founder and the executive chairperson of Democracy Works Foundation and former deputy editor of the Sowetan newspaper. During the anti-apartheid struggle, Prof. Gumede held several leadership positions in South African student, civics, and trade union movements. He was a political violence mediator and area coordinator for the National Peace Committee during the multi-party negotiations for a democratic South Africa, and was seconded to the South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He's the author of several #1 bestsellers. His most recent books includes Restless Nation, Making Sense of Troubled Times, and South Africa in BRICS, Salvation or Reunation. Prof, I'm going to give you 15 minutes and the floor is yours.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to try to be, I don't think I'm going to take all of that 15 minutes. I'm going to be much shorter. To start off with, just to, in general terms, I thought I'll give a bit of a comparative first. I think if one look at lockdowns and freedoms, a lockdown necessarily necessitates restrictions on certain democratic rights. The imposition of quarantine results in restriction in a limiting of the freedom of movement. Even in democracies, in quality democracies, one will have the increased surveillance undermines, basic rights, the use of technology to track movements, undermine democracy, and so on. So the idea of a lockdown really is restriction in freedom. And really it is the balance between, on the one hand, the scale and severity of a pandemic, to save lives, and then the balance between, the individual rights of people. How do we get that? Now, unfortunately, if you look across, it's not only in South Africa, many other developing countries, of course also industrial countries, where that balance between, on the one hand, restriction of freedoms, of trying to save lives through lockdowns, and a restriction of freedoms have gone off kilter to the side of undermining freedoms. Now, if one compare different kinds of lockdowns that we've seen, over the last few weeks in other countries, we've seen, some countries have pursued, of course, these hard lockdowns, including South Africa, level 5, these really hard lockdowns. And often the hard lockdowns really has been taken place, and in the hard lockdowns, extreme limits on movements and, freedoms and so on. Many non-democracies, many low-quality democracies, and many low-trust societies have pursued these hard lockdowns. Then there's also, a second group of countries that have pursued much more soft lockdowns. And this is often, better quality democracies, more high trust societies, where citizens were allowed or given more room to, to do things, or given more responsibility or individual responsibility, really, rather than no limit of freedoms, but where they had their own, individual citizens had a responsibility, or taken a responsibility at the individual level to, for example, pursue social distancing and so on. So responsibility was on the individual. Now, if one look at these, and before I go ahead, there is of course also the outliers, countries, for example, that did not see COVID-19 as a threat, like Brazil and so on. They would have soft lockdowns just because the focus for COVID-19 was not seen as a threat and so on. But if one take conclusions between the countries that have gone the hard lockdowns and those versus the soft lockdowns, those that's gone the soft lockdown way have been actually much more effective. Effective in saving lives, effective in even the economy is returning back after lockdowns and so on. So and those with the harder lockdowns, of course there are the exceptions, but the harder lockdowns have struggled very much, has been less successful, essentially compared to those in the soft lockdowns. I mean, of course, there are the exceptions. In China could be exception, one could argue. Now, if one look at, why countries pursue either hard or soft lockdowns, it's to do with the country's political culture. If you look at the South African political culture, and also generally countries with the hard lockdowns, the political culture really often where there's limited public trust in the state. The moral authority often of a state have collapsed. Things like poor public service delivery, corruption, lack of public accountability, of public representatives of the state, means that citizens really are not going to comply with rules. They're not going to take it seriously and so on. So across Africa, many developing countries in Eastern Europe, you will have that kind of political culture. So countries then, these countries in these categories respond then with a hard lockdown because it's very difficult to convince their citizens to comply because the citizens don't trust the state. Because the state, yes, the state may be in some cases maybe elected democratically, but the states and elected representatives are not accountable and so on. So then often hard lockdowns is almost unavoidable, and we South Africa, we sit within that in that space. I mean, I did say that a softer lockdowns have better outcomes so far. Because of the political cultures of these societies, less corrupt, efficiency in the public services, more accountability, more trust. You see Singapore, South Korea, and so on. They had softer lockdowns, better outcomes. Now, then, if in South Africa context, then if we have if we have no option but to go for a hard lockdown, what then? What kind of democratic oversight, can we then focus on to hold elected representatives and public representatives accountable during the hard lockdown? I think the first thing is what has been missing in the South Africa context is broad participation in decision making, and from all levels of the COVID-19 strategy. Partnerships with social partners, we haven't seen partnership with civil society, we haven't seen partnership with communities, we haven't even seen partnerships with communities also. It also in this context with a hard lockdown is going to be really important is evidence-based, rights-based decisions. the democratic oversight institutions like parliaments, ombudsman offices, Chapter 19 institutions play their role in oversight. We have civil society oversight, media oversight and monitoring, citizen oversight, and then that we have accountability. If anyone, the police or the army or any state official is found, in wrongdoing, then there's public accountability and there are consequences. And finally, to end off this, it's going to be very crucial, even in a post-COVID-19 period, the basic human rights is enforced as dignity, human dignity, and that the citizens and civil society and media, monitor that. And then a right to freedom of expression. I mean, there's been occasions, during this lockdown where some people in the state assume that, well, because the president of the government issue instructions, people cannot publicly disagree with it. So there has been an undermining of freedom of expression. And then, of course, quality information on a regular basis. Because in a hard lockdown, or any kind of lockdown, it's very important to have access to information and transparency, and also that enforcement of lockdown rules doesn't discriminate on race, class, religion, or on dignity.
Thanks, Prof. Gumede. Prof has raised quite a number of issues that I just want to touch on very briefly in some of the concepts that we need to rethink about quite seriously. Issues of trust, hard and soft lockdowns, the role of civil society, but also the need to re-evaluate human rights, non-discrimination, and very importantly, what do we mean and understand by human dignity? So those are very, very key points that we need to consider. So there is, Prof. Gumede and Cooper, there is some Q&A points that you might want to read. The one is quite a lengthy point there. I'm going to now introduce Heinrich Bomke. And Heinrich, do you want to unmute yourself and perhaps share your video? Heinrich has agreed to just provide us with a brief overview in summation of the discussion that's taken place so far. He is the leader of the Rule of Law project at Democracy Works. Heinrich?
My name is Heinrich and I curate a project at Democracy Works which deals with the rule of law. And in that context, we've dealt with some of the COVID-related issues. I'm not really free to disagree with anything Prof. Gumede said because in a sense, he's my boss. So I'll just wink so that you know. But at the same time, it was amazing to listen to two distinguished academics set out their views on the implications of COVID. And I'm not going to really give any of my own views. I don't really feel that in their company I could add much. But what I could perhaps add is just give a few ideas on the way in which the legal system has dealt with COVID. Now, in the beginning, as Prof. Cooper correctly pointed out, there was an emergency and we all sensed that there were terrible things afoot and the government had to come to our aid. Like the Leviathan, we all put up with extreme inroads into our rights and our freedoms because based on the stats at the time, we were headed for calamity. And so it was very easy for us in that first month and a half to give up these freedoms and trust our government. And Prof. Cooper makes the point that has unraveled over time. It has unraveled legally in two ways. The first is the status of the decision-making body that was making all of these incredible decisions for us about where we could go, who we could see, that our jobs, we couldn't attend to our jobs and we couldn't visit family and so on. And that was the National Command Council. And for a long time, its status was unclear. And it interfered with the constitutional provisos that certain cabinet ministers must make decisions. And Parliament had an oversight role when it came to inroads in our freedoms. And if there was this ill-defined council out there that was making all these terrific and terrifying decisions, who were they? And how did it fit into the Constitution? So that was the attack that many people raised against the regulations. That attack has largely fallen away now, in my view, because the president has come up with the explanation that it's a subcommittee of cabinet. And in that sense, all the quibbles around the status of this committee have been cured. The legal quibbles have, to a large extent, been cured. So we're left in with the other problem, and that is the content of the regulation themselves. To what extent are they necessary? For instance, we've seen the smoking lobby want to continue to sell cigarettes. We've had worshippers in small mosques who wanted to gather. And there are various other examples where the content of regulations have been queried, either in court or in the public domain. And the example around the clothing that could be bought or purchased is a particularly funny one. Now, a lot depends on the evidence, the statistical evidence for the content of the regulations. In other words, do the regulations do more good than harm? Because everything in our country is a balancing act. No one has absolute rights. My right to swing my fist famously ends where your nose begins. So the whole thing was about evaluating whether a particular regulation, on average, was doing more good than harm. And that's where the difficulty comes in, because as Prof. Gumede pointed out, we need regulations that are decided based on evidence. They cannot be decided on hype. They cannot be decided on fear. They cannot be decided on bad maths and bad statistics. And if one of the things that we have learned from this pandemic is that we are very poor at understanding statistics and calculating risk, because really what the regulations should be doing from a legal point of view is permitting managed risk. You cannot eliminate risk. There'll always be a risk that something will happen that could kill you. Returning to work, you could catch COVID and die. But how do we manage that risk so that on average for society, more good happens than bad? And I think that if, just speaking as a consumer of news, if there's one thing that has happened during this lockdown, it's that I don't trust stats anymore. I don't trust experts anymore. The medical evidence has changed up and down all the time. I remember scowling at people wearing masks at one point because I thought, based on the prevailing medical advice, that they were wasting masks and it didn't really help with preventing anything. Now masks are very much necessary. So the regulations need to be underpinned by science, by stats, by evidence, and I think that that's where all the problems in the legal terrain are now focused. Infection rates, how many free beds are there, what are the risks posed by the various activities. Those are things that will inform court challenges going forward, because our courts are, and our executive is, permitted to make rulings that sort of shrink our rights and our freedoms to some extent, as long as there is justification for it. So we mustn't also lose sight of that our constitutional order does permit for limitation of rights as long as there is a proper reason for it. Dignity, how do we quantify dignity? The indignity of losing a parent and not being able to go to their funeral is something that I don't think we've properly got around. And it really is, I agree with a former speaker, I think it was yourself, Ragnar, how exactly do we quantify dignity in this balancing of rights and freedoms? I don't quite agree that agency has been lost in exactly the same way as Prof. Cooper set it out. Yes, we need to reclaim agency, but to me the split isn't between the rich and the poor who lack, the rich would still have some sort of agency under the COVID regulations and the poor not so much. To me, it's more about the individual and the collective. For instance, Collins Causa, a poor person, was not permitted to drink in his yard to the point of being executed, perhaps, being killed. Whereas taxi drivers yesterday, without masks, were permitted to congregate at will, and all sorts of regulations were overlooked. Quite correctly, that was a correct decision to make. So I think the real distinction that will creep into our society going forward under regulations will be the difference between the disempowered and those that are able to disrupt, those that are able to be militant, the agency of the militant, those militant because of their money, because of their cultural capital, or their ability to block roads. They will be able to assert from time to time zones of freedom and exemption from these regulations. Whereas individuals, it could be a rich person in Stanger as an individual, will be stopped by a petty bureaucrat from going on a jog with his kid. Because at that moment, he's unable to credibly resist those everyday tyrannies. And then just to round off, I'd like to point to a couple of positives. In the legal realm, I stumbled upon a case where Nehawu had taken the Department of Health to court, and the basis of its application was found to be bad in law and in facts. They were asking for personal protective equipment that had in fact been delivered. And the judge, in awarding costs, said something that I think is the one positive we can take away from this. And that is that in the world of law, there are new rules that have now been written under COVID. You can't drag people to court on silly grounds any longer. The court is going to frown upon that because resources are scarce. And if you look at some of the big law firms, many of them are going out of business, which I think is a good thing, or losing clients because clients now don't have money for silly fights. They're settling matters. And I think that coming out of COVID, we might very well find that some of these monolithic, great, huge white shoe law firms that bill clients in extremis and only settle on the doors of court because they need to bill as much as possible. I think that those practices in law are going to be under pressure because there simply isn't going to be money to fund that style of social contestation and conflict resolution. Just some comments.
Thank you, Heinrich. That was really very, very thoughtful and thought-provoking, especially given the short notice that we called upon you. Professor Skoper and Komeda, I think you can, stop your video and allow yourself to be viewed. Who would like to go first in perhaps trying to respond to the Q&A by Vuyani?
Advocate Ngalwana raised some very intriguing points, and basically, he's saying that the regulations make it a criminal offense for anyone to criticize government in dealing with COVID. And there needs to be the intention to deceive, but that this has to go through an arrest process and then appear in court. He also raises that there's so many applications being brought, and they're already contradictory findings by the high courts right now, and that these probably would best be served by joining them together so that a larger group of judges can come to a decision that's more binding. And raises the interesting caveat that the Superior Courts Act leaves it to the Minister of Justice to submit to the Chief Justice this kind of thing. So it's again involving politicians. I think that the government has been loath to charge people under these regulations. I've caught on media that certain people are being charged, but perhaps not exactly for this section. This looks like it will not survive. And Advocate Ngalwana knows this as a senior advocate. It probably won't survive constitutional protection challenges. But just the very fact that it is there says that if left on their own, our politicians will do things for self-serving purposes and for ensuring that whatever they do does not get criticized. I mean, to criticize, especially which, in our country, which is fairly vibrant, is something that is quite alarming, that it's there in the regulations. The fact that the courts need to join these. I think in the acting judge decision on the tobacco matter, he did defer to other courts, but in this, but there ought to be direction, probably from the judge's president to say, look, let's join these. And I think this allows Heinrich and other entities to join in these applications as amicus curiae, to say there's so many of these, should they not be joined? That I think will assist a court to come to a better decision. Otherwise, we're going to have lawyers again, and as Heinrich quite correctly pointed out, lawyers again doing these kinds of things, and it'll move from the National Command Council and their shenanigans to lawyers being again at the top of the poll in shaping opinion. The other fact that, the other point that Advocate Ngalwana raises is how come our media tends to be more stenographers rather than critiquing and raising issues. I think that the politicians are quite smart. You know, many of the politicians tend to be smarter than many of our journalists. Indeed, many of them are more reporters than journalists. And that's part of the difficulty we have in a system where we've been dumbed down educationally. So the calls for journalism to be at a higher level, I think are good calls, but we simply don't have the grit that is out there to be able to hold government to account. And you notice that the moment we started saying SG for a secretary general of a party, that familiarity, even though it was Gwede Mantashe and that avuncular kind of person whom the media tended to love, but the lines get blurred. We then are enjoined by the political people to use their language instead of resorting to language that is more independent and clearly not of the herd mentality. So what can I say? All of us bear the marks of our origin, and in the last 26 years, there's a clear socialization that's happened. And indeed, I would suggest that the majority of journalists are actually supporters of one party or the other. And therefore, they're unable to rise to the occasion to question issues. Somebody else raised the issue about something good has come out of COVID, and that's to be acknowledged. But why should we wait for a crisis like this to provide water? It's quite rich to actually say, if you don't have soap and water, use sanitizer. That's like Marie Antoinette saying, because they don't have bread, let them eat cake. You know, I mean, who can afford sanitizers? And you've seen the price gouging. But these are the clear contradictions in our society where the poor, the massive, as sociologists call it, the underclass, will remain there. And the only time that we take note of them is when they protest and there's something violent that happens. So hopefully this period gives us time to think through this so that as we begin to emerge, there's a more compassionate, more considerate way that we deal with ourselves and with each other. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. Heinrich, perhaps you would like to respond while we wait for Prof. Komede?
I'm completely covered by what Prof. said.
Okay, all right. Is there any questions in the chat function? There doesn't seem to be any questions there. There's a question here by Tina Ace about where do the UK and European countries like Germany, France, and Italy fit in terms of the hard or soft lockdown distinction? I think Prof. Cooper, that's for you. Where am I?
Yeah, since William is offline,
Yeah.
look, I think they tend to fall between. They were in hard lockdown, but they tend to now be in soft lockdown. There's a different approach. The irony for many of us in the health and other spaces is that this virus knows no borders, recognizes no immigration, and yet our responses have been narrowly nationalistic. If we look at the EU was the first to deconstruct from a European Union boundary to individual boundaries. And so it is as if by building a wall in the south, Trump will prevent something happening, by doing lockdowns in the way that we've done them without consideration of our neighbors and without a regional response. What the World Health Organization has been crying out for, a more human solidarity approach. The UN Secretary General saying, we're in this together. But the Deputy Secretary General of the UN, Amina Mohammed, has said that the fault lines are clearly emerging in our world. And we're seeing it in our country. The fault lines are massive. If serious listed companies have filed for bankruptcy, then we know we're in trouble. Who can ignore the queues in major cities in the US with very fancy cars queuing for food parcels? So in our society, we haven't got basic support systems. The kind of enablement for the poor is so paltry that a lot of people are probably going to have ill health because of lack of sustenance, and they're going to be susceptible to COVID. So I think that we are on a tinderbox situation, that unless government is more responsive and uses this period to jack up its systems all round, we are not going to come out of this very well. If we have not been able to still deliver textbooks, if we still have the kinds of things that we have in our schooling system, then we're going to subject our kids to being purveyors of COVID instead of protecting them. Unlike in other places, like in the UK, they've had food provided, meals provided for kids who were in that bracket. In our country, left to their own resources. And we've seen people, politicians, use the food parcels as part of corruption. So unfortunately, the culture of entitlement and corruption seems to be, under the cloak of COVID, something that is going to haunt us for a while.
Thanks, Prof. Eshan, I'll come to you now. Maybe perhaps let me just give Prof. Kumede a chance to come in. Prof. Kumede?
Thank you. So, I had some electrical issues, but I just wanted to come in just to say that, one of the big weaknesses that we've got here is that there is no parliamentary oversight over, these new regulations. Hasn't been debated in Parliament and so on. So it really is an oversight. So going forward, we're really going to have, just one thing we're going to have to look at, whether that's the first thing. And second aspects of it, whether aspects of it are constitutional. This is a new moment. We haven't been there before, but we have to look at it. And then the third, our ombudsman's offices that we have, we've got in the army, and then we have, independent oversight over the police. Really, we have to ask ourselves, are these officers effective? Do they have the teeth? Do they have the courage? And then we also have to relook just in terms of, freedom of expression. We cannot, in a society, have regulations where you cannot criticize government decisions, because it is, especially in a hard lockdown, it really is important that there is criticism, because criticism is oversight. Without criticism, there's no oversight. It's a key pillar of oversight. It's also a key pillar of everything. It's a key pillar of human rights, of dignity, of equality, of everything. If there's an issue there, we really have to then look at the constitutionality of disallowing freedom of expression, if that's the case. Although I don't think it's, the regulations make it disallow freedom of expression. It really is more of those, in government or in politics who are of a much more autocratic bent, who would try to use, some of the regulations for undemocratic methods. But I mean, it was also very worrying. There was, for example, at the beginning, there was a case when the security forces were criticized for being hard-handed, that some parliamentarians was supporting them and said, look, it's a good thing they're doing their job. So clearly, we also have there's a political culture where even members of parliament who are supposed to defend the rights of citizens actually goes against citizens, actually promote the idea of heavy-handedness, of infringing on human rights in affecting compliance. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. Ashwin, I think you've had a comment, a question, sorry.
So, I just wanted to ask of any of our panelists, but also refer to Prof. Ace. This idea of also just thinking about hard and soft lockdowns as examples of a way to go. I was reading a paper yesterday that it's also predicated on what health facilities are available. So, for example, this writer was saying that, Germany had an excess of beds in hospitals, and the World Bank, etc., was telling them to cut down their beds. And so Italy had eroded its healthcare facility. So this idea of just having, and that's why social science is so important, humanity is important, because let's call it like it is. The performance of neuroscience and our scientists have been incredibly pathetic. I mean, we've had people who sat on the National Command Council telling us we need a hard lockdown because of the numbers. And they then came on TV and supported the lockdown going downwards while the numbers were going upwards. And one of those scientists was actually laughing while he said it. And I think it does raise the question of the intellectual enterprise, the independence of the intellectual enterprise. And when you do join with government as its lieutenants in policies, you can't cry like Glenda Gray when it doesn't go according to plan. So I think we haven't done enough questioning at that level. Yes, we've been good at the law and so on, but the law traditionally has its limitations because all they do is to put it right when you show it. So I think intellectuals have been shown to be very, very, very weak and haven't intervened in the debates and tried to prise open the door of the science. So my second question is just to pose it to somebody like Heinrich. He talked about zones of freedom. Well, some social scientists at UJ wrote a paper that said, look, man, the old are going to die, they're more vulnerable, and they're going to die anyways. So why don't you, let them stay in their zones of death, and we can get on with life. It had the most hits on the conversation, I think. And I was just wondering whether he wouldn't want to talk about zones of death, not only zones of freedom.
Okay, Heinrich, before you answer that, there's one or two other questions on the Q&A for you as well. So I think while you're unmuting yourself, let me just see here. The one question is from Tina Ace, which says, what long-term effects do you foresee for the position of whistleblowers flowing from COVID-19? And the second one is that you raise an important issue about the inconsistencies of the statistics and models about COVID-19. What kind of accountability does he think should be in place for such models? It brings into place knowledge questions about COVID-19.
Just before I deal with those, and I forgot to take notes, so I'll look in the comment section. But there's something else I forgot to mention earlier, and I would really like to understand, perhaps from William, Ashwin, Seth, and others, is how difficult is it going to be in future to make the argument for open borders after a pandemic? Because I know they're totally separate things. The one is a political philosophy, and the other one is a response to a pandemic. But when your first and most effective port of call for dealing with danger is to close the borders, does that logic not seep into political philosophy in some way? That if you've got a jobs bloodbath, close the borders. You've got crime, close the borders. And I just wonder whether that isn't also going to become a lingering side effect of the pandemic, where you have the seepage of a medical solution into broader political discourse. I'm not sure what role, what the effect of COVID will be on whistleblowing, whether it will increase or decrease. And I would guess that if a person comes up with facts that shows that something went wrong, either in the dispensing of state subsidies, I think there's going to be a lot of that, where a lot of that money has gone missing and has been chowed, to use the South African colloquialism. Or maybe there'll be people who talk, come forward with information about the stats being wrong, or willfully being wrong. In that case, I think it'll just go through the normal whistleblowing sausage machine. And if it has a legal dimension, it'll be dealt with there. There will be some more evidence of corruption and potentially coming from whistleblowers. I really am not sure. The zone of death thing is interesting that Ashwin raised, because one of the things you've got to look at when you are making decisions about how bad COVID is quality of life. Now, this is going to sound perhaps a little bit harsh, but if you look at Italy, for instance, they had a lockdown in Italy that decimated the economy. And if you have a look at the average age of people who died in Italy from COVID, it was 83. That is average. And the average amount of comorbidities that people in Italy had were 3. In other words, they didn't just have diabetes, and they had diabetes, hypertension, and something else. So if you have a look at locking down the Italian economy on the basis of average age of death of 83 with 3 comorbidities, what quality of life were the people robbed who died? Now, it's a horrible question to ask, but I guess the social scientists wouldn't want to duck that question, because in this balancing act that the law has to perform when there are disputes, we have to look at whether it's worth doing something to the economy for that quality of life. Now, I don't have the stats for South Africa, but that's it's probably different because South Africa is a younger nation. But certainly, I think sociologists in Italy are going to ask that question, and then they're not going to call it a zone of death, but they may very well say, statistically, what actually was the trade-off here in terms of quality of life versus the quality of life of people in future. And remember, in health terms, we're not only talking about COVID-related health issues. We're talking about people who are not making chemotherapy appointments, people who are not getting their prostrates checked in the meantime, all sorts of things that are happening, which will have run-on health effects down the line. So that is what I mean by stats not only being wrong, but also being incomplete. And the very last question, I'm afraid I forgot what that was. Okay. I think it's the first one.
Sure. It says, the question raised is about the inconsistencies of the stats models and statistics, and what kind of accountability do you think should be in place for such models? It brings about into question or into place the knowledge questions about COVID-19.
I think the other academics are better placed to talk about the reputational damage there.
Okay. Ashwin, do you want to respond? And then I think there's 1 or 2 key questions that I want to come back to in the Q&A. Or are you fine, Ashwin?
No, I just want to say that, these are, and I think Heinrich raises the real issues. I expect the response to the academics who wanted the old to be in a zone of death is that if the child support grant is 500 Rand and the old age pension is 1,700 Rand, then rather kill the child and keep the old person alive, because it's economically more beneficial to the family. So, these are the kind of questions I expect one starts to ask in a politically incorrect way, I expect.
Okay, the one question raised by Malisi Mane is, I do concur with Prof. Gumede and Cooper that quarantine is an imposition which is restrictive to human dignity and rights and freedom of expression. But wants to know also there's about 3 questions he raises. It's how should the current imposed rules be discussed, and how can one freely express herself without stigmatized as not abiding by lockdown or quarantine rules? The other one is what is going to happen to those who have lost their jobs? This is a very important question. Who have lost their jobs, livelihoods due to no source of income. And the third is, should there be any media campaign to alert society and remove the hypnosis created by the current state? Really good questions there. Prof. Gumede, do you want to take a stab?
No, absolutely. I mean, it is really going to be important in terms of the economic response, the development response. And again, unfortunately, there again, you know, we haven't been as effective. Because if we don't get save struggling businesses on time, if we don't give unemployment relief on time, if we don't give the universal grant to people on time, you know, we will then have other consequences. So, you know, so we may survive the first periods, you know, with the limitations on our rights and so on. And then in the post-COVID-19, you know, we have no other freedoms. Again, you know, we're alive, but alive without any prospects, you know, no opportunities, no jobs, sicker, you know, other illnesses, malnutrition, gangsterism, all of these kinds of things. Yeah. So really, it is going to be very important that we also, as citizens and civil society and academics, monitor, you know, in order to ensure that there is a coordinated and integrated response. So it's not just a health response in the stricter sense of the word, but a response also, you know, to rescue the economy and also the societal problems, to deal with the society, you know, the social impact of COVID-19. Which, I mean, so far we haven't seen any of that from government. We haven't seen any blueprints, any plans, which is evidence-based of what to do with the economy and what to do with the social impact, you know, whether it's mental illnesses or whether it is other kinds of illnesses, whether it is the rise that we will get, you know, people unemployed, of populism possibly coming, or xenophobia, gender-based violence, and so on. So what is missing, and where citizens and civil society really also will have to respond beyond the narrow health response, technical health responses, in terms of what is the policy response, an integrated policy response to all of the things that's coming out of COVID-19.
Yeah, that's very true. Prof. Cooper, do you want to perhaps add there?
I just want to say that this requires the vision and requires the will and harnessing the capacity which does exist, but which gets ignored. So the will to be able to do it, I think, is lacking in most of the leadership, because for many, it's the agenda tends to be about themselves. They've shown that they've not met the targets that they are supposed to be meeting in their own ministries and departments. The vision is simply not there. We're in a heavily reactive mode, and we've used terms that actually underpin public health, but have relied on them so slavishly that we've been unable to get out of it, you know, like flattening the curve and stuff like that, which we haven't been able to get out of. The ability to rely on existing competency is one that our government over time has been woefully loath to do. I know that they have relied on consultants, the usual suspects, auditing and other entities whose experts are your and my students. And when you talk of the psychological, behavioral impact, you know, I, on behalf of the psychological fraternity, offered to do something for government in March on intercession for frontline people. It went from one to the other, acknowledged, and then it died. Probably the mistake was, I said we'd do it free. If we said we're going to charge 15, 20 million, instead what they do is they rely on the well-being services. Now, the well-being services are workplace related, not trauma, frontline, horrendous stuff. And yet we've got bright people in the academy that don't get utilized. And I dare say a significant number of them will offer their services at a pittance compared to the consultancy rates that these companies charge. So we are not using our extant skills and competencies. Instead, we seem to be scratching for the worst. You know, it's like, how many of you have attempted to get some kind of position in the public space? And then they'll invite you to a shortlisted session, and then choose somebody who's deliberately underqualified or who hasn't got what you've got, and then say, you know, we had PhD so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so, but we chose Mr. X. And the bureaucracy now is evaluating the efficacy of how they're responding to COVID. So it's bureaucrats, sort of coordinated very loosely by the National Research Foundation, but they are writing the chapters on different aspects. So there's nobody monitoring performance, and COVID provides the ideal umbra to avoid more scrutiny. And that's why the kinds of relief, sometimes it may shock us from the courts, but I think that it's about time that we had clearer pronouncements so that this period, it's now what, 3-4 months or over 4 months already, does not become a new norm, and we get used to suspending the rights we were beginning to clamor for. And heaven knows, in the Zuma era, we could scream to high heaven, we could go anywhere and have the biggest protests this country has seen, and fell on deaf ears. So now we've got the same people being thrown with a change in the electoral laws. And if we don't do something to shape that outcome, we're going to fall back into that space of party compacts, a proportional representation corrupt system, because Omri Mokwale, one of the ANC 101 stalwarts, has been saying, you capture the party, you capture the state. And that kind of approach is going to continue. So unfortunately, we don't have much good news, except that we do have a more literate population out there. People know their rights. And that is one of the safeguards. But the longer the emergency regulations subsist, the longer will people get used to this. And then it means rejuvenating the free zones of the mind that we need to make sure that we restore the vibrancy of our democracy.
Thanks, Prof. Pupa. Those are very enlightening comments. I think we're going to round off now. We have addressed many of the comments here on the Q&A. Prof. Gumede, would you like to give some final comments? And then I'm going to go to Heinrich. And Ashwin, I would like you to just say a vote of thanks, please, to our distinguished panel. Prof. Gumede?
Yeah, no, just, finally from my side, if one look at, those countries that I said earlier was more successful with a soft lockdown. So preceding to the soft lockdowns, one of the reasons why they were successful, in 2006, the World Health Organization actually told countries to prepare for influenza-like epidemics. And you also look, those countries with a soft lockdowns, with more accountability, governments govern more in a public interest, less corruption and so on, they actually took that seriously. South Africa, sad, was one of the countries that didn't, because, we got a message in 2006, we ignored it, we had no political will, no priority, and so on. So that tells you quite a lot of, soft lockdowns and accountability by governments. And, the results have been so much better also. Look now, the countries that's coming back into the economy, and opening up the economy, New Zealand, the Singapores, and the South Koreans, and so on. And they had soft lockdowns. And preceding, they had actually built the health sectors, preceding COVID-19. They have been very, very accountable. They've been, it's more rights-based, and so on. So that is really crucial. So going forward, COVID-19, I think the lesson for South Africans, all South Africans, COVID-19 will have to be hold government accountable. This is going to be absolutely important. The moment corruption and lack of accountability takes hold, society is very, very difficult in crises to deal with crisis. So that's really, if anything out of that. And then the last part of it, to look after the vulnerable, is going to be really crucial. So whatever we do in our economic recovery and our social recovery, the vulnerable will have to be looked after at all levels. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. Heinrich, there's a last question here, which I think is actually quite important. Why is it that the silence of large corporates is so deafening? The lockdown is causing more harm than good to them, as well as to their customers. Yet CEOs and CFOs do not use their influence to push back on the irrationality of the lockdown in the interest of their customers and investors. I don't know if you have a comment to add to that, and perhaps some final concluding comments.
Yes, I think the answer to that is that your take on the pandemic is a moving target. And there's so much mixed messaging going on there. You don't want to be seen to look like you don't care about lives by attacking regulations, and to have the ire of government on you, or for your stance to be misrepresented on Twitter, and then to lose market share to your competitor who kept quiet. So I think the safest thing for any marketing person is to keep your head below the parapet and let civil society and government fight it out, and then pick a winner right at the end and say, well, Nike was for freedom all along if the regulations are shot down. And if they are upheld, to say Nike gave a tick to regulations all along. So I think it's purely a business decision why they don't say much, like they didn't under apartheid say much, under Zuma they didn't say much, and so on. Not that I'm likening those two things, but whenever there's a controversy, they tend not to do anything. The concluding remarks on the law is that I think COVID has basically been superseded by political events. We saw that COVID has basically ended in America for all intent and purposes, with political controversies and electoral cycle coming up. So maybe COVID will really end when people need to be got out to political rallies again for some reason. Then it just sort of disappears. It disappears because of supervening political forces that then just relegate it to just another normal health risk.
A new normal.
New normal.
Ashwin?
Yeah, just to pick up on what Heinrich said, I think the person who asked the question about big business is misunderstanding how big business operates. They are involved. They are lobbying. The head of the casinos have been meeting with the presidency. They just don't toy in the streets. And often they are more effective than the toy. Ask Mazzotti about lobbying and business and the tobacco ban. I just want to say a big thank you to all our guests. If our guests don't know and other people are participating, and I say this, because people have worked hard at this. Sociology department at UJ is the #1 sociology department in South Africa. And it's a big thing for us because for so long we've been behind the lager, literally and figuratively. And now we become #1, overtaking UCT and WITS. And it's an encouragement to Prof. Gumede, Prof. Cooper, and Mr. Boomka are part of UJ. You got to cross the floor, brother. You're allowed to cross the floor these days and join us. It's the winning team. But I think the most important thing, I think, for all of us is that, Prof. Gumede has worked at this, and it's called Democracy Works. And somebody asked a question, what does it say that more authoritarian governments did better at controlling COVID? And I think that is why the importance of democracy, because actually the country with this authoritarianism is where the coronavirus emanated and took so long for us to come to understand it. So more than ever, I think, and that's the message, I think, that democracy works. It's the most powerful instrument we have. And I think we're very honored to have had the 3 contributions which have gone over. It shows how one can get caught in ideological constraints. We go across ideological boundaries, but cohere around the idea that the defense and advance of democracy is the most paramount thing, even during a pandemic. And we thank you for your contributions, and we hope you join us in future webinars.
I think just from my side as well, I would like to really echo what Ashwin has said, and that we really value both your time, your reflections, and very thought-provoking questions for us to consider not to accept a new normal. And I think that is the message that needs to go out to everyone. So Prof. Gumede, Prof. Cooper, and to Heinrich, thank you very, very much for this very enlightening and robust debate and discussion. We really appreciate it. Thank you, and thank you to all our participants and guests, and to Ashwin, who did a lot of hard work behind the scenes.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.